Hey, this is QAShahin, and today we are going to talk about promises. We're going to talk about promises in WebDriverJS. We're going to talk about what a promise is in general for JavaScript and why it is important for you to be able to understand how promises work for WebDriverJS. So first of all, as part of the agenda for this video, we're going to jump straight into the code. And one of the first things we're going to do is talk about promises. We are going to talk about the importance of understanding a promise, and we're going to write a promise as well. Okay, so first and foremost, what is a promise? Now, if we revert back to the last 3 or 4 videos in this video series, where when we wrote code, we were basically doing things in a very sequential like manner. For example, in this case, we are just getting a URL. But in the previous videos, we spoke about elements, and what we were doing was that we were somehow finding an element through a find element method and then doing something with it. So what was basically happening was we were running things in a very sequential manner. So for instance, we did something like this: driver find element by tag name something like this. So all this was doing was finding an element based on tag name, which in this case is an anchor tag, and then clicking on it. The thing to understand here is things are happening sequentially, i.e. this will happen before that, and once this happened, then this will happen, and so on. It's running in order from top to bottom. Promise is something different. The way a promise works is on a very conceptual level. The idea of a promise is not to return a value, but it is the concept of eventually returning a value. So what does that mean? Well, if we take this method into account, what we're basically saying is once find element returns you something, then just do the click. But because this is very sequential, it's all going to happen in one go. Nothing really waits for something else to happen. It's just going to go find element, boom, click, boom, done. Great stuff. A promise is slightly different. A promise is where we say something along the lines of find an element and promise me that you will find this element, and then click on it instead. Now, this is a very strange concept to wrap your head around, because when we program, we don't really think like that. All we say is we want things to happen in a sequential manner and just sit down and do it. But promises don't really do that. Promises work differently. Now, why is it important to understand promises as part of WebDriverJS? Now, I did say a second ago that this was happening sequentially, i.e. when we do driver.find element, it was just finding something and then clicking on it. Behind the scene, almost every method that you get as part of driver is actually using a promise. So almost every method in WebDriver is returning not an object, but it's actually returning the promise of an object, i.e. it's essentially telling us that at some point in the future it will return the object. Now, that may sound very strange, it may sound very contradictory. What is the whole point of doing this? So this kind of dives into this whole idea of synchronous versus asynchronous coding, which we may get into in a future video. But the important thing to understand in this particular video is the actual inner workings of what happens in terms of when something is returned. Now, when we write code, so let's just say I now write another line of code. So let's just say find element by name, and let's just say some name, it doesn't really matter, contact underscore link dot quick, or maybe find element by ID dot send keys Hello. What is actually happening here? Now, this is very simple. Things are happening in order from top to bottom. But believe it or not, all of these methods are actually using promises. So the thing in this video that we're going to look at is how to actually use a promise. Now, it's important to understand promises because even though this is using promises under the hood and you don't really need to expose yourself towards learning and trying to use promises, there will be times where you actually need to use a promise in order to get the more inner details of a given element. So for example, if I go to, say, my homepage, and let's just say I want to get the text value of this. So if I inspect this, I can see that this has an ID of home_link. So let's just go ahead and do something with this. So I can say something like driver.find element by ID home_link. And let's just try and do something like this, get text. And that's it. And let's try and log this to the console. And let's save this and run this and see what happens. Okay, so if you look at this, this has now effectively returned, well, we tried to return the text of that link, but instead it's returned an actual object. So what does this mean? Well, it means that when we tried to get the text of that given object, it wasn't able to do that because what this does is it actually returns a promise instead of what you would expect, i.e. text. So what can we do to actually get text out of this? So one such way is to use methods and functions which allow us to hook into promises. So in this case, in order to actually get access to the object which is returned as a promise, we need to use a method called then. So what does this do? So what this does is this gives us a little bit more control over what is returned and actually do something with it. And it is the contents of the then that allow us to maintain some level of control over the object that is returned. And to do this, we write a new function, and in this function we pass in the parameter that we expect to get back in return. So in this case, it would be a link. Now, this does look a little bit ugly. We'll go through this in detail in a bit. Now, in here, what I now want to do is actually use this object that was returned as an object from find element. So let me start again. What find element is doing is actually returning a promise. We've kind of established that. And we then use this then function to actually get that promise of an object. And then we can actually start to interact with this object. So we can now say something like link.getText. And what this should now do is also return the text. But hold on, there's another problem. This will actually return an object also. Why? Because this also returns a promise. So this will not actually give us the text that we expect to come from that link. In order to get the text, we then have to invoke this then.function stuff again, because getText also returns a promise. And the way we would do this is quite simply then function, and then whatever it is that was returned as part of getText. So in this case, I'm just going to call it text. And then in here, we can actually try to then see what is returned. So in this case, we expect text to be returned. And since this is the last promise that is returned, we can actually try to invoke this. So we can say console.log text. Okay, so let's try to run this and see what happens. Okay, so as you can see, now home as a text was actually returned for that element. So in this video, we've actually gone through a very simple example of a promise, and we've tried to understand a little bit more about this stuff that is happening here. So in this video, we went through what a promise is and why it is important that you understand how promises work. And we also went through a very simple example of what a promise looks like when you try to actually interact with an object that is returned as a promise in WebDriverJS. Thanks a lot for watching this video. I will see you in the next one.